Good evening. Welcome to the Rourke. My name is Jonathan Rudder. I'm the director and curator here, and I want to thank you all for coming out for our final lecture of 2025. We'll be posting our lecture schedule for 2026 within the next 6 weeks here, so pay attention to our social media as well as our calendar, which you can find at therourke.org/calendar. Our lecture series this year has been made possible with the generous support of John and Carol Sue Andreasen. So if you see them out and about, been seeing John quite a bit at the Sons of Norway. If you see him there, thank him, if you don't mind. We appreciate his support. So tonight, we really have a wonderful topic for our capstone lecture, the artist as educator. Pedagogical experiments in contemporary art, and this is being delivered by Dr. Noni Brynjolson. She is an assistant professor of art history at MSUM, and her research focuses on contemporary socially engaged art. And she recently published a co-edited book titled Pedagogical Art in Activist and Curatorial Practices, published by Routledge in 2024. Originally from Winnipeg, Canada, she completed her PhD in art history at the University of California, San Diego in 2019, and lived in Indianapolis for 5 years before moving to Moorhead. So, friends, join me in welcoming Noni to the stage as it is.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming this evening. I'm really excited to be here and to share some of my research with you all. And thank you to the Rourke for inviting me to speak here. So I moved here about a year ago to start teaching art at MSUM, art history. So I'm still getting to know the local art scene, but I've really loved it so far. And it's really nice to see that there are places like the Rourke and other spaces here that support creativity and expression and experimentation. And that is part of what I want to speak about this evening. So I do research on contemporary art, and I'm especially interested in forms of community-based and socially engaged art that many artists have explored in the past few decades. And many artists, as part of this, have experimented with forms of pedagogy in their work. So they have thought really deliberately about audiences and communities that emerge through the work they're making, and how they can teach people through their work. So how they're communicating ideas, how their experiences of learning are unfolding, how can their work contribute to social transformation in the communities where they're living and working and practicing. So I'm going to talk about 2 specific artists today who I have done some research on, and they're both actually also employed as artist educators, right? So they're professors as well, they teach at universities. They think consciously about how to teach art in the classroom, but what I'm focusing on mainly is how they experiment with pedagogy through their art, so how they're sharing this with a wider public. And I'm also interested in how art has such a long-standing and deep-rooted connection with pedagogy. Right, so one of the first things that we do in school, even in preschool, or even at home as a form of learning, is making art. Right? So we use creative forms and acts of expression to teach all of these different subjects and ideas, especially when kids are young. And then this kind of recedes as they get older and pursue more specialized interests. But I think this connection between art and education is really important, and connects with also the co-edited book that I published recently that Jonathan was talking about. So the title of the book is Pedagogical Art in Activist and Curatorial Practices, and I co-edited it with another art historian whose name is Isabel Galliera, who has similar research interests in socially engaged and activist practices. So the book includes 17 different chapters from scholars and artists and curators who are writing on this theme. And it became a really diverse group of contributors, which was great. We had authors who were covering Central America and East Asia, Eastern Europe, Australia, as well as the United States. So it was a really exciting project to be part of. Isabel and I wrote the introduction to the book that looks at some of the history of what we refer to as pedagogical art throughout the book. So we're exploring the emergence of these practices as they relate to more recent socially engaged art forms in the past few decades. And the cover image here is from a community mural project by the Slovakian artist Tomáš Prafa, which was discussed in one of the chapters. So one of the common themes that comes up across the different chapters in the book, and that we also talk about in the introduction, has to do with this broad shift in educational practices towards what we might now refer to as active student-centered learning. So more traditional or older models of learning have typically operated through the model of transmission, right? So the teacher or professor is the expert, the individual who has all of the knowledge, and they are transmitting their knowledge into the passive minds of their students. So this model started to be challenged in the 20th century in a number of different ways. So these are just a few of the thinkers whose work has played a role in moving away from this kind of transmission-based model. So the American philosopher John Dewey, for example, emphasized this idea of experiential learning and argued that education must involve active problem solving and critical thinking, and that this was crucial to the development of a strong democracy. The Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget developed the theory of cognitive constructivism, which has to do with this idea that students process new information by adapting it to existing mental structures or frameworks. The Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky built upon this model and really emphasized that learning is a social process. So he wrote about students learning through forms of collaboration with their peers as being really essential in learning. Maria Montessori, for whom Montessori schools are named, was known for this model that emphasized self-directed learning in the classroom. And so teachers were really the guides, leading students through this kind of pedagogical process. And then the Brazilian educator and philosopher Paulo Freire explicitly critiqued this transmission model of learning for treating students as empty vessels to be filled with knowledge. So he advocated instead for a form of pedagogy that would involve dialogue and collaboration, in which teachers and students are co-learning through discussion of real-world problems. And so this developed into his theory of critical pedagogy. So this is just a very short list, and I'm going through some fairly complex ideas extremely quickly, and I am aware of that. But it's an overview that gives you a sense of how things were shifting in terms of these models of how people learn, and the most effective methods of teaching. So Freire's book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, was especially influential for artists who were working in the 1960s, who were increasingly interested in integrating lessons from the civil rights movement into their work. And he defined the pedagogy of the oppressed as a form of pedagogy that is done with, not for, oppressed peoples in the struggle to regain their humanity. So in his writings and his teaching, he emphasized the concept of dialogue as being very important, as well as active learning, collaborating with individuals and communities in the creation of knowledge. And so a lot of artists have been really inspired by these ideas and have put them into practice in their own work. So through engaging with communities and making participants active in the work that they're creating together. So this includes a lot of artists whose work might now be referred to as socially engaged art. And I find it very interesting that this shift in pedagogical practice that I've been talking about really parallels these shifts in art making, especially in the second half of the 20th century. So this is when we start to see the rise of art practices that are based on dialogue, collaboration, artists who are working with communities, like a lot of the same things, right? So this is a form of art practice that has been given many names. In the 1990s, it was referred to as new genre public art, also relational aesthetics. More recently, the terms social practice art and socially engaged art have become more common. But these are just a few of the key features associated with this type of artistic practice. So it's a form of art that can be difficult to define because, first of all, it often does not even really look like art, so it's very much not image or object-based. And it has connections with things like conceptual art, with performance-based practices, even with things like dance and theater that are often seen as outside the realm of the visual arts. But it frequently focuses on social issues that artists care about. It involves forms of collaboration and participation. It often takes place over long periods of time. So instead of looking at a painting in a museum or gallery, you might be involved in an experience that unfolds much more slowly, or take part in a project that happens over many days, or sometimes months, or even years. So these are works that are taking place in public spaces as well. They are building community, or sometimes working with already existing communities. They involve dialogue, and often that is the work of art, is just creating these spaces for conversation to happen. Another common feature within this type of art is that it is often very critical of the traditions associated with art, right? So this is one reason, I think, why so many contemporary artists have turned towards this form of art practice, is that they're fed up with the commercialization of art, right? They're seeking something different. They're seeking out an alternative. They're tired of trying to make it in the world of galleries and art sales and constant self-promotion. And so they're trying to make work that is meaningful in a different way, and potentially to different groups of people. So I think just looking at this list, many of these points correspond with these shifts in education that were taking place roughly around the same time, and that were being proposed by theorists like Ferre and others. So many art historians have written about this rise of socially engaged art in recent decades and have noted some of these connections to pedagogical experiments throughout the 20th century. For example, Grant Kester has described these projects as containing an openness to site and situation, a willingness to engage with specific cultures and communities in a creative and improvisational manner, a concern with non-hierarchical and participatory processes, and a critical and self-reflexive relationship to practice itself. And then the art historian Claire Bishop has talked about the rise of alternative pedagogy projects in the 1960s and how examples like the German artist Joseph Beuys's Free International University connect with contemporary discussions surrounding the neoliberalization of education. So Beuys's project was based on his concept of social sculpture, which for him meant that we could consciously shape the world that we live in, and that this action was a form of art in and of itself. So the Free International University that he created was this platform for promoting and experimenting with these ideas. Right? So it was a rejection of educational models as they currently existed through this pedagogical program that involved many of the aspects that I've been talking about. So this emphasis on dialogue, on community, on forms of collaboration, and then a critique of the transmission model of education. So for Boys, this was a way to transform society. He saw it as a way of being able to unlock the creative potential in every human being. And I think there are many different projects that I could share that highlight these links between critical pedagogy and socially engaged art in more detail. Boys' project is a good example. And I think in the book, what we were exploring was really like the merging of these things, right? So practices in education becoming more student-centered and active learning focused, moving away from that kind of transmission model. At the same time that we also see this shift happening in contemporary art towards practices that are more community-based and more dialogical. So that's why we're using this term pedagogical art in the book, referring to works by artists that are really consciously experimenting with these things. And you know, this has been noted by these art historians like Kester and Bishop, who are referring to what they see as a kind of educational turn or social turn in contemporary art. So you could look back even further than Boys in the 1960s and 70s and find experiments going on earlier in the 20th century. So some of the Soviet art schools that emerged after the Russian Revolution, for example, the Kutamas, which was the Russian state art school, and then the Bauhaus in Germany, a very famous example, which operated from 1919 to 1933, and is often been described as a kind of laboratory for modernism. And then in the United States, Black Mountain College in North Carolina, which ran from 1933 to 1957, and you know, really no coincidence that it started the year that the Bauhaus closed in 1933, which was due to Nazi pressure. So this resulted in many artists and architects leaving at that point, escaping to the United States, and then some of them starting to work as faculty at Black Mountain College at that point. So art education and art itself were really being transformed and reimagined within these institutions and within others like them. So this is some of the backstory for just understanding how this type of practice emerges in the later part of the 20th century, and for understanding its roots in both artistic and pedagogical experimentation and transformation. So one of the artists that I have been really interested in and written about a little bit is Suzanne Lacey, and I think her work connects really well with some of these themes. So she is a Los Angeles-based artist who has been active since the 1970s. And she continues to make work that is rooted in critical pedagogy and feminist activism, often through forms of performance and installation and participatory art. So this was a piece that she made in collaboration with the artist Leslie Labowitz, and it involved bringing women together to address the ways in which the media had covered violence against women in American cities. And this was following these highly sensationalized killings by the so-called Hillside Strangler in LA. So the piece that she organized with others involved numerous participants from different organizations in the city coming together and collaborating, as well as families of the victims. And so there was a motorcade of 60 women who followed this hearse to City Hall, where news media reporters were waiting for them. And when it arrived, 10 women wearing black robes got out and walked to the steps of City Hall, where they announced forms of violence against women, while there was a chorus of women who were surrounding them and yelling out, "In memory of our sisters, we fight back." So the goal of the performance was to raise awareness about domestic violence and sexual assault, and question the way that the media had covered these issues. And it received a lot of coverage and attention in the media. I think it's a good example of how art can respond to social issues, kind of intervene in these conversations, and also demonstrate some of the interests that Lacey would continue to work with throughout her artistic career. So addressing social issues that she cares about, bringing together lots of people in one space, encouraging dialogue. And she also maintains a really striking sense of visuality across these different works. Even though it's not based around one specific image or object, it's much more process-based. But color and fabric both play a really important role in a lot of these works. And so I'll show you a few more examples. She's an interesting figure. She's an educator as well as an artist, and she's now a professor of art at the University of Southern California. She came out of a very experimental art school program. So she was part of this program that started at Fresno State College on the West Coast, which was the site of a number of experiments with feminist art in the 1970s. So that included the first feminist art program, which was established by Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro at Fresno State. And so studios were only available to women artists, and they were encouraged to make work about their experiences as women. So in 1973, Judy Chicago and several other faculty decided that they were fed up with trying to offer feminist art education in a male-dominated institution. So they left the institution to start their own. And so they founded, at that point, the Feminist Studio Workshop. And this was the building that it was housed in Los Angeles. So this is where Suzanne Lacey got her start as an artist. And I'm sure that being part of this pedagogical experiment had an impact on her work, and in turn has had an impact on many younger generations of artists too. She had grown up in a working class family in a small town in California, and so for her, this meant that issues associated with class and economic inequality were always on her mind. So she was always interested in art and wanted to pursue it, but she has also talked about how she often felt like she should be doing something more practical. She always kind of had that in the back of her mind. So she worked as a carpenter following her time at art school, and she was then offered a position at the Feminist Studio Workshop teaching performance art. So the aim with this workshop was to be this kind of autonomous space for feminist art practice outside of traditional patriarchal institutions, so a kind of counter-public or counter-institution. And feminist artists were criticizing traditional institutions and their exclusion of women, but then they were also creating their own, so this active kind of institutional building. And this became a model that many would later follow. Lacey is also interesting, I think, because she's an artist whose work was really informed by a lot of the aims of the second wave feminist movement. But already in the 1970s, she was starting to think about some of its limitations, too, and trying to incorporate perspectives that would align with what we now might refer to as intersectionality. So I think this project by her is a good example of some of that. She created this piece in the 1970s in the Watts neighborhood in Los Angeles. And this was inside the Guy Miller homes in Watts, which were homes for low-income seniors, most of whom were African American. And so she was an artist in residence there in 1975. This was just after she had finished art school. It was one of the first projects that she worked on. And the project that she worked on involved spending time with one of the residents there, who was this woman named Evelina Newman, and then collaborating on installations and performances together, including the creation of the sewing club for residents of the building. She has described this project as a form of feminist performance, and the form that it took emerged out of Newman's interests in quilting and sewing. So the first installation for the project was initiated by Newman, and the idea was that they would organize residents and join together to form this quilting club where they would make these small lap quilts that you see in the photos here. So I think it's an interesting example because it shows these connections between people and communities with different backgrounds, different identities, who are finding some common ground in shared experiences, which became a theme in later works by her. And then it's also interesting because it exemplifies this mode of practice in which residents or participants' needs and desires and interests directly shape the form that the work takes. So she's not going into this place and telling people what things should look like, right? She's very open to their feedback and to the final form that the work is going to take. So I think definitely aligning with some of Paulo Freire's ideas in that sense, just in terms of working with communities and engaging in dialogue to create work together. This project was another example of how her work has explored this concept of intersectionality. So she worked with 150 women for the project who are described on her website as elderly activists, recent immigrants from Japan, India, and Mexico, Native Americans, youth from group homes, disabled women, friends of the first woman in space, and several residents of Guy Miller homes in Watts, who were her previous collaborators. So the aim of this project was to talk about how you could form a sense of community across different cultures and backgrounds. And it took place during a different, very heated moment of public discourse, focused on anti-immigration sentiment, which was driven in large part by the increase in refugees from Central America in the 1980s due to political instability and civil wars. So the form of the work involved each guest bringing a dish that represented their cultural heritage or their country of origin. And so they ate together and they wrote messages and recipes on the tablecloth. And then after dinner, the performance continued with women who were sharing stories associated with survival on an open microphone. Some of her works have focused on the theme of aging and older women, including this piece, which was titled Whisper, the Wind, the Waves. So for this project, she worked with a group of women in Southern California who were over the age of 65. And they created this performance on a beach in San Diego. And just as a little sidebar here, this is actually a beach that I went to all the time. I lived in San Diego for 7 years while I was doing my PhD. And this was very close to the campus. And it's so funny to look at these pictures now and see like how exotic they look. Whereas like this just looked normal to me at the time. But if you went and visited this beach now, you wouldn't actually be able to go onto the beach because it's completely inhabited by seals. So it's the seal beach, and it's where you go to see the seals. And they have just completely taken over, and people can't even go swimming or anything. But yeah, she did this, when she did this in the 80s, there were no seals yet. She worked with this group of women. They all are wearing white here, right? They're sitting at these tables, they're having conversations about their lives and their everyday experiences. They were talking about their experiences with aging. Many of them were talking about how they actually felt about death, and then also about how they felt perceived by other people around them, how they felt their roles were perceived in society. So, there were the performers in the very center. There was also an audience that came and watched from the cliff, which you can't really see here except maybe in the foreground of the photo on the left. So the audience was able to hear some of these conversations and then walk down onto the beach at a certain point and listen more closely. And this is a kind of a common form that a lot of her work takes. There's this kind of element of eavesdropping that she brings into a lot of these performances, which I think is interesting. This project by her was in Minneapolis. So this was at the Crystal Court inside the IDS Center, and also explored aging and older women. So in this case, how aging women are represented in media and public opinion. So it was developed over a 2-year period, and that's the case with a lot of her work, is that she's working on these projects for sometimes several years in a row, right? There's a lot of planning that goes into a lot of different elements. So over this time, she was working on creating a series of events and classes. There was a lecture series, there were film screenings, there was a whole entire media campaign that was created in collaboration with other artists and volunteers. And I think that's another kind of common thread that runs through a lot of her work, is that they have these really conscious pedagogical elements in them. So designed to connect with audiences on different levels and at different scales too. And then the culmination of the project was this event that took place on Mother's Day in 1987. And it featured 430 women from Minnesota who were over the age of 60. So they were seated at these tables that you see here, and then on top of this red rug. So the entire thing was designed to resemble a quilt. And then at various points in the performance, the women would move their hands on the table, so it would change the look of the quilt piece from above to the spectators who were gathered all around. So there were hundreds of people who would come and were able to watch this performance. And then once again, at a certain point, they could come and walk down and listen to the conversations that these women were having. Another project by her, called The Roof is on Fire, involved organizing meetings between youth and police in an Oakland, California neighborhood. So again, it was focused on conversations, kind of a similar form, and featured 220 public high school students having conversations on different topics that were important to them. So they were seated in dozens of cars that were parked on the very top here. And then there was an audience that was walking around, and they could listen in to these conversations that were happening in the cars. This work also featured a lot of preparation beforehand. So there were workshops that were happening, and art education classes going on. Again, this media campaign that she organized. And she also collaborated with teachers at the school, so she was working directly with teachers. Students attended a lot of planning sessions beforehand. Also trained in different aspects of media production and media coverage. There's some more photos here from the actual performance. So it was also aired as an hour-long documentary on the local NBC channel. So it really reached a pretty wide audience in that sense. Young people who were involved in the performance talked about conflict with the police as being a major concern in their lives. And so in response to this, she worked to create this conversation series between them and police officers, which resulted in this video that was made that was then actually used by the Oakland Police Department for training in community policing practices. So interesting that it had all of these different outcomes, including some that were very concrete. This piece by her continued to explore some of these themes. So it was an installation and performance piece made in a gallery in San Francisco, and involved working with seamstresses from the city's garment industry. So the participating women would come and sit next to these huge piles of used clothing, red, white, and blue, and then they would hand stitch them together into these long lines that trailed all around the gallery floor. So their work in the exhibition space was intended to bring public attention to the seemingly invisible labor of women in the context of race and class connected to the city's garment industry. And then she has also talked about how it was meant to evoke the work of iconic figures like Betsy Ross and ideas of patriotism. So it can be seen as this kind of critique of this sort of pseudo-patriotism that benefits from cheap labor while demonizing the rights of immigrants at the same time. And then I think it's really important to point out that these works are, they're seeking back to something, right? They're trying to intervene in power structures, they're trying to find ways of organizing within specific formations of power that will have an impact on marginalized communities. So in that sense, really embodying the spirit of critical pedagogy that Barry wrote about. She is also a writer, so she edited and wrote the intro to this book called Back in the Terrain in 1994, which has been really influential for a lot of contemporary artists who are interested in community-based art practices. And so in the book, she is talking about new genre public art as art that communicates and interacts with a broad and diversified audience about issues directly relevant to their lives. So she points out that community-based artwork involves a different relationship between the artist and the audience compared to previous forms of more traditional art. which I think you could make some connections to the transmission model again. So artists are learning all of these new skills and methods, right? They're learning how to collaborate, how to cross over with other disciplines, or sometimes how to translate artistic concepts that might be viewed as very opaque into more accessible language. So that can be a real skill as well. And then I wanted to show a short video that focuses on a more recent work by her. So this was from a project called Between the Door and the Street that took place in 2013 in New York. And it's about 5 minutes. I'm just going to play the first 3 minutes of it, just because I feel like video really gives you a good sense of what these works actually look like and embody. Something figured out before, but just change my sound.
Yeah.
If it doesn't work. There we go. Okay. Maybe I tried to send this bill on to you again. You heard for a minute? Seems like yeah, it just wants to. That's okay. Yeah, we can have either sound or video. That's okay. If you're interested, she does have a very good website. She's one of these artists who is just so good at documenting her own work and archiving everything. I'm sure she has many assistants who help her do that, but if you want to check it out on her website. Yeah, so I want to look at one other example as well, which is the artist Tanya Rivera. So she is another artist whose work has experimented with pedagogy and whose socially engaged art practice connects with many of the theories of Freire and others. And I think there are some interesting parallels with Lacey's work as well, and with some of the other earlier examples I was talking about. So Rivera is a Cuban-American artist who is also an educator and works as a professor of art at Harvard. And throughout her career, she has been interested in experimenting with education as an art form. So this has included creating art schools in her home, including the Behavior Art Department, which she initiated while she was living in Havana between 2002 and 2009. And this was meant to be a platform for the teaching and practical application of social media. So she has said that it involved the creation of a pedagogical model that makes up for the lack of civic discussion spaces on the function of art in present Cuban society, and promotes new generations of artists and intellectuals. And so I think there are definitely parallels with something like the Free International University. Participants are coming from different fields. They're coming from architecture, theater, music, dance, as well as art. The activities were free and open to anybody, and exchange across different disciplines and across different geographical contexts was emphasized in the project. So it became this way to promote the free exchange of ideas in Cuban society, which has been really important to Bruguera across all of the different works that she's made. So these are some photos from that project in Havana. And she's talked about her work as a kind of political, timing-specific art. So art that responds to the context and the moment in which it is being made. Another example of hers that makes use of a similar kind of mock institution was this project, which was titled the Instituto de Artivismo Hannah Arendt, or as she put it, INSTAR. She used this acronym, INSTAR, which makes use of a very corporate-sounding acronym, first of all, but it's also a verb that means to instigate. And so this project started in Havana in 2015, and it involved her holding this collective reading of Arendt's book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. And this was a 100-hour performance that she undertook, in which anyone who wanted to could come and participate and read parts of the book together out loud, and also talk about its meaning in the context of Cuban society at the time. So a lot of her work has involved just these really simple gestures. So things like holding public readings, or sometimes just setting up open microphones. I think the parallel with Lacey's work is really interesting, just in terms of initiating these dialogues and conversations in public spaces. Bruguera is definitely more overtly critical of the government and critical of systems of authoritarian power and censorship. She has also made work that is critical of US politics and anti-immigration rhetoric in the United States. But this was a piece that she organized in 2009 as part of the Havana Biennial called Tatlin's Whisper. And so for the piece, she provided this temporary platform for free speech, which is normally denied in Cuba. So anyone in the audience could come to the stage and speak for 1 minute. And then after a minute, they would be escorted off the stage by 2 actors in military uniforms. One of the really interesting things about this piece is that she was able to use the pretext of art and the very visible Havana Biennial, which featured all of these international artists and curators and a huge amount of public attention. She used this as a kind of shield and as a way to create this platform for free speech that wouldn't otherwise be possible. That was the thinking, at least, and it was true in 2009. She was able to do this. But then when she tried to recreate this performance in 2014 in a public square in Havana, she was detained by Cuban authorities at that point, and her passport was confiscated for 6 months. Since then, this has become a repeated pattern. So she has become very publicly visible. She has been repeatedly detained and harassed by Cuban authorities for making work like this. And this reached a breaking point in 2021 when she was detained and questioned again, and she agreed to leave Cuba for good at that point. So that's the point at which she took this position at Harvard in the US and gave up her ability to return there, but she was able to negotiate for the release of 25 political prisoners. So that included artists and activists who had been incarcerated there for protesting the regime. So I think it's a really good example of how closely linked art and politics can become, right, in this ongoing struggle in Cuba for freedom of expression and human rights. And I think something that can be seen as this real lesson to us in our current moment too. Just looking at a couple more examples here of how she brings pedagogical experimentation into her work. So she created this project starting in 2010 called Immigrant Movement International. And it involved organizing artists and residents in her Queens, New York neighborhood to address issues related to immigration together. So there were all of these different classes that were offered on a range of different things. The list from their website includes the following: dance, nutrition, childcare, bicycle maintenance, construction safety, classical music, English language through art history, Spanish for Mandarin speakers, computer literacy, screen printing, immigration law, and counseling for women who are victims of domestic violence. And that was just a partial part of the list of all the different things that they have offered. But it was really whatever there was a need for. They would try to organize a workshop or a class on that topic, and find someone who could teach that skill in that particular class. So offering these classes and these services and resources really became a way to bring people in the door and connect them around a common cause. It really led to people coming together in this space and speaking out against anti-immigration policies that were affecting them as well. And then she has also created this archive of related socially engaged art practices, or as she refers to this type of art, arte utile, or useful art. So this idea that art can be a tool for social and political change. And I see this as a kind of pedagogical experiment as well, in the sense that it involves collecting and sharing information and resources with a wider public. It's interactive, it is open to submissions and suggestions, and so it's attempting to be this kind of democratic public space and educational tool, connecting back to some of the educational theories of thinkers like John Dewey and Paulo Freire again. So with Bruguera, we see her examining public protest, freedom of speech, creating alternative institutions, and then also working within government too. So in 2015, she became an artist in residence at the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs in New York. And in this position, one of her roles was to communicate with the city's population of undocumented residents to help them access services. So this was a temporary position. She only did it for a year, but I just thought it was interesting and wanted to include it just as another example of how artists have gotten politically involved, right? Not just with these alternative experiments and alternative institutions, but sometimes also working within institutions to try to transform them and have an impact as well. So in looking at these projects by Lacey and Bruguera, I have been trying to look at some of these connections and how artists have been consciously experimenting with forms of pedagogy in their work, and how developments in education, and especially the critical pedagogy of someone like Freire, how this is connected and has these parallels with contemporary socially engaged art. So we've seen some examples of how artists are addressing important social issues within communities, making work in public spaces to reach a wider audience, using educational techniques like small group discussion that we see in many of Lacey's works, reflecting on freedom of expression, building alternative institutions, and also working in currently existing ones. So I will end it there. I would love to hear your questions and comments and feedback. Just also a little shout out to the book here. If you are interested in reading more, I know the hardcover price is just incredibly expensive. It's ridiculous, but there is a cheaper ebook option, and I'm happy to email anybody who would like to read part of it, like the introduction, if you're interested. So just reach out and I will send it to you. So yeah, thank you. What questions do you have?
Okay, I have what is, I think, essentially a definitional question.
Yeah.
So there are two related questions. You made a lot of references to performance. At some place you used the phrase close to the socially engaged art is often not about image. It's often not image or object-based art. Question one, do you have criteria that would separate this from theater? And number two, do you care?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. I don't know, I feel like people are always wanting to know about these definitions, and And I feel like it's always tricky to like place a line around certain forms of practice or certain disciplines. I think that there is a very wide spectrum, and I think there are some parallels between theater and what you would typically associate with theater. And then these practices that are theater-like in some ways, in the sense that there is this kind of element of performance, but they're often not what you would expect in terms of a more conventional sort of theater performance.
Well, theater people would say you're being very conventional about theater.
Yeah, that's true.
Theater is not that conventional.
Well, so I think that you could make the comparison with something like radical experimental theater, right?
Yeah.
But then there's often there's that emphasis on interaction and participation and working with particular communities to make the work that can be a form of theater, but I think they're pushing it a little bit more towards that side of things within a lot of these projects.
So what would it have to do to be, and you're of course correct, that there's no straight line, no black line between any fields of human endeavor. But what would it have to do to be art, not theater?
To be art and
I mean,
not
art is
theater.
Theater is
Yeah.
right, but you're not at your school.
I mean, I think that's why I like the term performance, because it encompasses histories of both of these things, right? So to me, I feel like what is the purpose or what is the point of trying to find where the dividing line is? You know what I mean? Yeah. I don't know. I feel like there are lots of connections between them, and looking at those connections is really interesting, right? Because it makes you think about what is the actual performance that we're looking at, and where is the line between artist and performer and audience member too. So yeah, but I think for sure, a lot of these artists are really interested in histories of theater and performance, and they're trying to bring that into their work. Yeah.
It seems like it's very communal, that art, because as you look at these art on the walls here, they're very individualistic. So you have the two, have they had a way to bring it down to the individual level, whether it's pedagogical art. It seems like a classroom, which ties in with that.
That's really funny.
But
yeah.
but I don't know if it's moved into the individual level that we see in these pictures of the wall here. If they figured out how to do that.
Yeah, I don't know. What do you think?
I don't know. I think they were critiquing that sort of stuff too. So, but it's still, I'm not sure if in any of their works they're doing individualistic stuff.
Well, I think that's interesting because so I teach a class at MSUM that focuses on some of the history and theory behind socially engaged art, and we actually look at a lot of paintings, right, and more conventional or traditional forms of art in that class, because this form of artistic practice has deep roots, not only in theater and forms of performance, but in the history of the avant-garde. Right, so all of these histories throughout the 20th century, going back earlier into the 19th century, of artists who are interested in kind of challenging the conventions of art, but who are also so interested in kind of questioning where the boundaries were between art and life, and bringing these things together. So it's almost like in the 20th century they start to go in different directions, right? And some artists get more into theater and performance, and then other artists are becoming more interested in abstraction and geometric patterns.
As a painter who's taken that socially engaged art class from Dr. Brynjolson, I think in my mind it's different on approach. If I'm going to paint a mural where I control the design and that type of thing, it would be what we classify as traditional art. And there's not hard boundaries. I mean, these are overlapping circles all the time. But in socially engaged art, I'm engaging the community to build community. And that starts with the design. It's not my design, it becomes our design. it's involving other people, learning from their lessons to make the project better, the collaboration that I think Noni said 4 or 5 times is used the term, but that really is what struck me as the difference as we studied it.
But I think it's something like Joe Sacco, who does some wars and other things. There's art just bringing out the situation in Gaza years ago and other place.
Yeah.
But it just seems like he's doing individual work, but somehow he's connecting with others.
Oh, yeah, for sure. There are so many artists who are making political art in different media that are still exploring these things. Yeah.
You said that Lacey was one of like the key figures in this second wave feminist movement. Do you know if she worked with like any other feminists at that point in time to expand, like besides the one that you showed?
Yeah, well, so she was a key figure in the feminist art movement.
Oh.
She certainly contributed ideas to second wave feminism more broadly, but I was talking specifically about feminist art practices. So I think the point that I was trying to make in talking about that is that she's bringing a lot of these ideas from the second wave into her work, like the work that she's making in the 1970s. But then she was already starting to think about some of these things that start to get talked about a little bit later, more in the 1990s with this concept of intersectionality. But yeah, for sure. I mean, she was part of this community of other artists and feminist artists and activists in Los Angeles at the time. So she was really closely working with Judy Chicago, who is this other very important feminist artist from that time period who started the program. Mary Shapiro, lots of other artists who were also came out of that program and who really had an impact on each other's work. Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
I was just curious which display of the pedagogical art connected with you the most, or was most interesting to you, and why?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Like which example I shared that I can personally connect with the most? Well, yeah, I was thinking about that, and Suzanne Lacey's work, I think, really shaped the direction that I went in as someone who was studying art history as an undergrad student. So I learned about her work when I was taking the course Women in Art. I was doing my undergrad degree in art history at the University of Winnipeg, and which is really cool because now I'm actually teaching that course at MSM. And so I learned about her work in this form of new genre public art, and that was really fascinating. So I think the piece that I learned about by her was the very first one that I showed, with that striking performance of the women with those very tall black hoods and costumes that they were wearing. But then I also found out about this project in Winnipeg that was influenced by Suzanne Lacey. So this artist named Edith Regier in Winnipeg had started this project called the Crossing Communities Art Project. And it was supposed to be sort of working along the lines of a new genre public art project. She was collaborating with women who were in prison and creating these exchanges of art and letters with professional artists who were working in Winnipeg at the time. So they started this project called the Crossing Communities Art Project, and that was the project that I wrote about for my undergrad thesis project, and then kind of continued looking at that and just exploring Lacey's work further and then getting interested in this whole genre.
I'm really interested in the kind of experimental education piece and now this experimental art piece. But my familiarity with it is like that 70s moment where things were kind of popping. Is it still going?
definitely going strong, and that's why I'm really sad that I couldn't show you that video. Because the video was from 2013, and it was a piece by Lacey that was kind of following along some of the same themes as in earlier work. So like these little conversation circles that she organizes where people can come and kind of drop in and eavesdrop and listen to what some of the conversations are focused on. But it was organized on the streets, I think in Brooklyn or Queens in New York, and many different generations of women coming from all different backgrounds, and it's really interesting to hear actually some of those conversations and hear what they were talking about and kind of compare it with the works from the 1980s.
Yeah.
And just see some parallels, but then also see how certain things had shifted too. Yeah, no, she's definitely still going strong.
And if you want to slip back a couple of slides to the website, that was very useful as a tool for us
Oh yeah,
in the
yes.
class. We spent quite a bit of time on that website looking for projects that interested us, but it does emphasize how much is going on right now.
So would you say you've seen examples in this community?
Oh. I have been looking for that, and yeah, if anybody has suggestions for artists that I could meet or interview who are working here and kind of work along these lines. I have met Anna Johnson. I know that she's doing some murals in public spaces in the community. I have heard of a few artists from the cities, so not here specifically, but in Minneapolis and St. Paul, based artists who are kind of working along some of these lines. But yeah, Fargo-Moorhead, I'm not super familiar with the local art scene yet to know enough about artists who are making this kind of work. So yeah, that's the best way. Yeah.
My suggestion is actually myself.
Oh, okay.
So I have done a lot of community organizing and I'm teaching artists. Right now I teach preschool as my day job, but my most recent project is with a close group of community organizers and the Organized People's Pride. And we're currently setting up a studio here in Moorhead. But our main thing is creating gatherings for people to be socially engaged. So in August, we held a Pride event that was anti-corporation and abolitionist and colonial nature. And that was our first gathering, but the people that I'm working with have also, we've done this work in our own smaller spaces for years. Yeah, so we're kind of trying to expand that project now, and I think listening to this lecture gave me a lot of terminology that I could potentially use to describe it, but in terms of socially engaged practice.
That's great. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I would love to talk some more.
Yeah.
Her work seems to overlap. That's what.
I know. Yeah, I was thinking that, yeah, it's tied into.
She found out something.
Yeah. MSUM alum too. Yeah. Yeah.
I was just wondering, is there any cases that you can show that, no, this is just pure activism and it doesn't necessarily fall underneath
Yeah.
the umbrella of art?
I feel like that's another kind of definition or concept question that is so tricky, and that is something that does get debated all the time within this field. It's just like, why not focus on all of your efforts on activism or protest, and like what is the art actually adding to this, right? And I feel like so many artists and people who are part of these movements and part of these organizing movements would say that there's so much that it's adding, right? It's the aesthetic experience, it's the idea of gathering and finding community and kind of drawing people together. And I think it's really like in that idea of creating conversation and dialogue that this work is so powerful and kind of speaks to many larger audiences. But yeah, it is something that gets talked about a lot. It's just like where's the dividing line between what is protest and what is an art form. Okay, well, thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Finished, right?